The plane flew low over Washington, D.C., skimming the tree line like a crop duster over a field. In the early 1990s, U.S. analysts ran the numbers on what would happen if an aircraft like that released 100 kilograms of powdered anthrax upwind of the Capitol. Their estimate: tens of thousands affected at the low end, potentially more than 1 million in the worst case. No flash, no sound, no smoking crater, just an invisible mist drifting through quiet suburbs and office blocks, settling into lungs. Tonight we open a file that still unnerves people who work in quiet government buildings and noisy hospital wards alike. The story of the biological bombshell and what the historical record really says about bioterrorism. The weapon you do not hear coming. Biological weapons occupy a strange place in the landscape of fear. On paper they look almost perfect as tools of mass destruction, cheap compared to nuclear arms, made from organisms instead of enriched metal, and capable, at least in theory, of turning an ordinary city into a quarantine zone. Some analysts have called them the poor man's atomic bomb, emphasizing how little infrastructure a state might need compared to a nuclear program. Biological agents fall into two broad categories. There are replicating organisms, bacteria, viruses, and fungi that infect a host and multiply, and non-replicating toxins, which are poisonous products of organisms like the botulinum toxin. They are tasteless, often odorless, and delayed. You do not hear the moment of attack. You only notice when the first patients arrive at an emergency room with symptoms that look, at first, like ordinary food poisoning or flu. That time lag is what keeps planners awake at night. But when we step away from the scenarios and look at what has actually happened, a more complicated picture emerges, one where intent, capability, and sheer bad luck collide. Salad bars and a test run. The first large-scale bioterrorist attack on U.S. soil did not involve anthrax, Ebola, or a secret state laboratory. It involved salad bars. In 1984, the Rajneeshee commune in Oregon was locked in a bitter local political struggle. To tilt a county election, members of the group contaminated salad bars at 10 restaurants in the small city of the Dalles with salmonella bacteria. Their goal was simple: make enough people sick that voter turnout would drop among their opponents. Over several weeks, 751 people fell ill with severe gastroenteritis. 45 were hospitalized. Nobody died, but the community's restaurants and reputation were devastated. At first, investigators suspected ordinary food handling problems. Only later, after a separate criminal investigation into the commune, did the truth emerge. Culture samples from the group's own lab matched a strain that had swept through the Dalles. This incident shows what a determined non-state group can do with a common bacterium and basic microbiology skills. It also shows the limits of that power. Hundreds sick, but no collapse of the wider system, and no successful seizure of political control. The attack was real, deliberate, and carefully planned. It was also, from the perpetrator's perspective, a failure. The invisible plume over Sverdlovsk. 15 years earlier, on the other side of the world, the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk experienced an outbreak of anthrax so unusual that Western analysts immediately suspected something more than tainted meat. On the 2nd of April 1979, spores of Bacillus anthracis escaped from a military research facility, Compound 19, when a worker reportedly forgot to replace a filter. An invisible plume drifted over part of the city. In the weeks that followed, at least 60 to 70 people died from inhalational anthrax, a form almost never seen in natural outbreaks. For years, Soviet authorities blamed contaminated meat sold in local markets. Only after the end of the Cold War did Russian scientists and Western investigators piece together the real story. This was an accident at an offensive bioweapons facility. The Sverdlovsk episode is often treated as a case study in two things at once. First, it demonstrates how lethal a properly aerosolized biological agent can be, even when the amount released is small and the wind is, by sheer luck, blowing away from dense urban neighborhoods. Second, it highlights the practical problems that haunt biological weapons programs. Even a state with a sophisticated laboratory network struggled to control its own product, and chose denial over transparency when disaster struck. The lesson is unsettling. Large-scale biological accidents are possible, but they are also difficult to manage, to exploit, and to hide. Saddam's arsenal that never fired. By the time coalition forces faced Iraqi troops in the 1991 Gulf War, intelligence agencies suspected that Saddam Hussein had invested heavily in biological weapons. They were right. Post-war UN inspections later revealed that between the mid-1980s and 1991, Iraq had developed and weaponized three main biological agents: anthrax, botulinum toxin, and aflatoxin. Inspectors found that the program had filled roughly 200 aerial bombs and 25 ballistic missile warheads with these agents and deployed them to operational units before and during the war. Yet none of those weapons were ever used. Why? Analysts point to a mix of reasons: fear of massive retaliation, uncertainty about how well the weapons would actually disperse, and concern that poorly protected Iraqi troops might suffer as much as the enemy if biological clouds drifted unpredictably. The Iraqi program shows the high end of what a determined state can build, and the strategic hesitation that comes with it. Biological weapons look powerful on paper, but in practice they are politically toxic, militarily unreliable, and hard to aim. In other words, even some of the most authoritarian regimes have hesitated to pull the biological trigger. Aum Shinrikyo and the cult that kept failing. If Iraq represents the state side of the ledger, the Japanese cult Aum Shinrikyo is the most extensively documented non-state attempt to build a biological arsenal. During the early 1990s, Aum spent large sums and recruited highly educated scientists to produce agents like anthrax and botulinum toxin. The group reportedly even sent members to Central Africa in an effort to collect Ebola samples at the height of an outbreak. On paper, this looked like the nightmare scenario: apocalyptic ideology paired with scientific talent. In practice, Aum's biological program was a string of failures. Their attempts to disseminate botulinum toxin and anthrax either used harmless vaccine strains or produced ineffective preparations that never caused detectable illness. Frustrated, the group turned to chemistry instead. In 1994, they released sarin gas in Matsumoto, unaliving 7. In 1995, they carried out a larger sarin attack on the Tokyo subway, erasing 12 lives and injuring thousands. Aum demonstrates that even well-funded extremists with access to modern equipment find it difficult to translate theory into a functioning biological weapon. The gap between a petri dish and a battlefield or a subway car is wider than it looks. Letters in the mail. On the 18th of September 2001, 1 week after the 9/11 attacks, envelopes containing finely milled anthrax spores were mailed to news organizations and U.S. senators. 5 people suffered fatal symptoms, 17 were infected, and thousands more underwent prophylactic treatment and screening. The Amerithrax case was, in physical terms, small, just a handful of letters, but its psychological impact was enormous. Postal facilities shut down. Offices were evacuated after ordinary dust was mistaken for spores. The United States rushed to deploy new biosurveillance systems like the nationwide BioWatch air sampling program. Unlike the Rajneeshee episode, the Amerithrax mailings used a classic military agent in a highly optimized powder. Unlike the grandiose crop duster scenarios, the delivery method was simple and low-tech. The incident sits at an uncomfortable midpoint, proof that an individual insider with advanced skills can cause real harm, but also evidence that prompt public health response can limit casualties, even when an agent as dangerous as inhalational anthrax is involved. How big is the biological bombshell, really? When we line these cases up, the Oregon salad bars, the Soviet lab accident, Saddam's unused stockpile, Aum's failures, and the anthrax letters, we get a record that is both more reassuring and more worrying than popular imagination suggests. On the reassuring side, the historical record shows very few successful large-scale bioterror incidents. Many attempts either fail outright or fall far short of the apocalyptic predictions. Technical barriers matter. Turning a pathogen into an effective weapon requires stable production, controlled particle size, environmental robustness, and a delivery system that doesn't destroy the agent before it reaches its target. That combination is much harder to achieve in practice than in fiction. Even ambitious programs like Iraq's or Aum's ran into problems with formulation, storage, and dissemination. On the worrying side, we only need one success. Analyses by the U.S. Office of Technology Assessment and later studies have repeatedly estimated that, under ideal conditions, tens of thousands to millions could die from an efficient airborne release of anthrax over a major city. These are models, not observed events, but they underline the stakes. There's another issue. Biology doesn't stand still. Advances in genetic engineering and synthetic biology raise concerns that, in the future, actors might try to modify organisms for increased virulence, antibiotic resistance, or stealthier symptoms. Experts have warned that the same tools used for life-saving research can, in principle, be bent toward darker purposes. However, there is a strong counterpoint here. Much of the poor man's atomic bomb rhetoric has been criticized as exaggerated, shaped by worst-case thinking and geopolitical anxiety more than by careful data. Recent scholarship argues that biological weapons are neither as easy nor as universally attractive as the metaphor suggests, and that talk of inevitable proliferation may say more about our fears than about the real distribution of capability. So we are left with two competing truths. Biological agents can be devastating. History and modeling both support that. But building a weapon that actually produces those worst-case outcomes is fiendishly complex, and most real attempts have either failed or been constrained in scope. The civilian front line. One thread ties almost every case together. Civilians are on the front line. The Rajneeshee attackers targeted diners, not soldiers. The Sverdlovsk plume drifted over factories and neighborhoods, not trenches. Aum's siren struck morning commuters. Anthrax letters arrived at television studios and Capitol Hill offices, not armored bases. Modern cities, with their centralized food supply, dense housing, and recirculating air systems, provide tempting surfaces for anyone inclined to weaponize disease. A contaminated water source, an infected food shipment, or a pathogen released into a building's ventilation system could, in theory, produce widespread illness before anyone realized an attack had occurred. Defending against that doesn't look like missile shields or air raid sirens. It looks like something much more mundane and much harder to maintain. Robust public health systems, rapid diagnostic capacity, clear communication, and trust. Those are the tools that limited casualties in Amerithrax, that now underpin global campaigns against outbreaks, whether natural or deliberate, and that would be vital in any future biological incident. Between hype and silence, so where does that leave the so-called biological bombshell? One reading is grim. The same scientific revolution that lets us design vaccines in months also lowers the barrier for malicious tinkering. New techniques could, in time, make it easier to build agents that are harder to detect, harder to treat, and harder to trace. If even a handful of actors cross that threshold, the consequences could outrun anything we have seen so far. The other reading is quieter, but no less serious. The cases we have, Oregon, Sverdlovsk, Iraq, Aum, Amerithrax, suggest that biology resists being turned into a simple weapon. Technical, logistical, and political constraints blunt many efforts. What causes mass harm more reliably than microbes is fear itself. Panicked cities, shattered trust, and the social damage that follows even a small event. Between those readings lies the uncomfortable truth. We are not as helpless as early alarmist scenarios claimed, but we are not safe enough to be complacent. We live in a world where the line between hospital and battlefield, between lab and arsenal, is thin and constantly negotiated. The mystery isn't whether biological weapons could cause catastrophe. That part is solved on paper. The unresolved question is whether our systems, our ethics, and our vigilance will keep that catastrophe in the realm of models and counterfactuals. Because every mystery hides a truth.